Welcome. You, of course, are joining us for the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies seminar series. We today are going to have a discussion, as the title of our presentation topic indicates, on a theme which is of central importance to the city of Milwaukee, but also to many of our cities in the upper Midwest generally, and to varying extents around the rest of the country as well. And of course, that is the decline of Milwaukee's blue-collar middle class. So in other words, in effect, this is going to be a discussion about the deindustrialization of Milwaukee in the upper Midwest after its rather rapid industrialization. So of course, that period of industrialization created a great deal of prosperity for many, followed by a collapse in incomes, which disproportionately hit African-American communities. We are fortunate to have two esteemed members of Milwaukee's community that really almost need no introduction because of their quite visible presence, long-standing commitments to activism, and general just good sense that they have been purveyors of over the past decades. The first is Sheila Cochran, who, as many of you know, is the retired Secretary-Treasurer of the Milwaukee Area Labor Council of the AFL-CIO. She served for a couple of decades in that position, but what many of you know, but perhaps not all, is that she was a member of the proletariat at Delco Electronics, where she worked in the electronics assembly division, in which she was also a union rep there. So she is going to be able to impart invaluable personal experiences about what it was like to be part of Milwaukee's industrial working class that in effect approached becoming, and in many instances did become, a middle class. Also, we have Michael Rosen with us. Mike is a well-known fixture at the Milwaukee Area Technical College, where for 3 decades he served as a professor and is still frequently there, and is working with several different initiatives, including the FAST Fund, which targets resources to students who are struggling financially. He was the faculty union president at MATC as well, where they achieved some really impressive gains for their faculty. You know, he's a co-author of mine as well. We've done some pieces for the Capital Times, and I've always enjoyed and have profited handsomely in terms of my knowledge from my interactions with this. Also, I should say, UWM alumnus. So let's start with our presentations with these two members of our activist community here in Milwaukee. We're going to start with a macro view of the environment, the economic environment that led to this industrialization and then deindustrialization and its impact on African Americans. And then Sheila is going to follow up with a more of a microscopic view, which is going to take us into the lived experiences of somebody within that participation in that industrial blue-collar middle class. Michael, take us away, please.
Thanks, Jeff, and great to see you, Sheila, again.
See you.
One thing that Jeff didn't mention about Sheila is that during much of my earlier tenure at MATC, Sheila was my boss as the president of the Milwaukee Area Technical College Board of Directors. In any case, there's 2 statistics that I want to start with. And these 2 statistics, I think, tell the story. In 1970, prior to the collapse of unionized manufacturing, Milwaukee Black family median income was 19% higher than the national median. 19% higher. By 2000, before the Great Recession and before the COVID recession, the city's median Black family income was 23% lower than the national median. That's a swing of 42 percentage points. Here's the second statistic. Milwaukee's Black poverty rate in 1970 was 22% lower than the national Black poverty rate. By 2000, the poverty rate for African Americans in Milwaukee was 34% higher than the national rate. And it was the highest of the nation's 20 largest cities. Milwaukee was devastated by the combination of deindustrialization and deunionization, hemorrhaging family-supporting jobs and impoverishing residential neighborhoods, particularly Black neighborhoods in what today we know as the Central City. Between 1979 and 1983 only, just those 4 years, Milwaukee lost more manufacturing jobs than it did during the Great Depression. The double-dip Reagan recession devastated Milwaukee's Black community, and it has been plagued by depression-level joblessness ever since. But before we talk about the rise, before we talk about the fall, let's talk about the rise of Milwaukee's Black middle class, which was largely a blue-collar industrial middle class. And the roots go back to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union of Black workers organized by the socialist A. Philip Randolph, and to World War II. With the buildup of defense industries for World War II, many African Americans moved to the industrial and urban centers in the North and the West during the second phase of what's known as the Great Migration, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. They were moving both because they were pulled by the attraction of jobs and they were pushed by rampant segregation, bigotry, and violence in the rural South. But upon arriving here, they were excluded from working in most manufacturing plants and in defense industries. This was particularly true in Milwaukee. We were one of the centers of industrial centers that benefited from federal investment from the war, but our Black community, which was very small at the time, was excluded almost entirely. This changed in 1942 when A. Philip Randolph threatened to lead a march on Washington of tens of thousands of Black people, a double V, victory at home and victory abroad against fascism. President Roosevelt, who was leading the fight for democracy against fascism, recognized such a march would be an international catastrophe. So in response, on June 25th, 1941, Roosevelt created the Committee on Fair Employment Practices through Executive Order 8802, which required that no discrimination among defense industries or government, none. But he not only issued the executive order, he established a committee that required companies to appear in court and provide their employment statistics by race. In Milwaukee, A.O. Smith, Alice Chalmers, Harnischfeger, Heil, and Norberg, and notice 4 of those 5 no longer exist. Harnischfeger is now Kamutsu, so it's a Japanese-owned company. But all 5 of those were major defense industries in Milwaukee, and they were charged with failing to comply, and they were ordered to cease and desist. I'm just going to give you the example of A.O. Smith because I know that the best. In January of 1942, A.O. Smith had no Black employees. For any of you who grew up in Milwaukee or have lived in Milwaukee, that is an astounding statistic because that plant on North 27th Street and Hopkins was a major employer of Black Milwaukeeans in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and on. And yet it had no Black employees in 1942. Given the order, by 1945, there were 872 Black employees, 6% of the total labor force, greater than the percentage of Blacks in the city of Milwaukee at the time. This is an example of where the federal government did good things and it worked. It actually helped create equal opportunity employment. While Black workers were concentrated in the hardest and dirtiest jobs in foundries and tanneries, for example, at Allis-Chalmers, which was the largest employer during World War II, the foundry at Allis-Chalmers was almost entirely Black, while there were only a handful of Black employees at Allis-Chalmers. I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s now, only a handful of Black employees at Allis-Chalmers working on the tractor lines. But despite the fact that they were concentrated in the dirtiest and hardest jobs, they were covered by industrial union contracts. During the 50s and 60s, 30 to 40% of the city's labor force was unionized. Even militantly non-union companies like Grady Foundries and Falk had to pay union scale because of the level of unionization across the board. In 1950, of the nation's 5 largest cities, Milwaukee had the 5th highest income. As late as the 70s, the Black community thrived as part of the city's unionized middle class. Now, I don't want people to think that there wasn't racial discrimination, that there wasn't unfair treatment and racial segregation in housing, but there was a thriving blue-collar industrial middle class. Since then, major unionized employers like Allis-Chalmers, A.O. Smith, Continental Can, American Motors, Inland Ryerson, and I could go on and on and on, that once employed tens of thousands of workers, including Black workers, have closed their doors. Others that remained, such as Master Lock, Briggs & Stratton, which is hanging by a thread and just recently declared bankruptcy, Rockwell Allen Bradley, which has no hourly employees in the city any longer, Ember Meatpacking, and Harley Davidson have all significantly reduced their employment. The commercial districts that thrived around these plants, and just think about where the Walmart is on Capitol Drive, and all of the little shops, the auto repair shops, the gun shop for hunters, the bars and restaurants, all of these credit unions, sporting goods stores that serve the blue-collar industrial middle class have collapsed as employment and discretionary income plummeted. The loss of this employment, the historic backbone of family-supporting jobs, has been relentless and substantial since the 1970s. After peaking in 1963, manufacturing employment declined by over 77% in Milwaukee. In 1970, manufacturing employment represented 36% of the city's job base. Today, less than 10%. Deindustrialization has accompanied this decline. Between 30 and 40% of the rise in inequality is estimated to be the result of the rise in inequality. I'm not sure on my time limit how I'm doing here, Jeff.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, good.
You don't have to use all 10 if you've got 10.
So the decline in the economy's ability to provide good jobs is closely related to the bargaining power of workers, especially those at the middle and the bottom of the pay scale. As the labor market in the United States has restructured, including the decline in inflation adjusted value of the minimum wage, the fall of unionization, deregulation, pro-corporate trade agreements, a dysfunctional immigration system, and macroeconomic policy that has, with few exceptions, or I should say until recently, kept unemployment well above full employment levels. This has substantially reduced the bargaining power of U.S. workers, effectively pulling the bottom out of the labor market and increasing the share of bad jobs in the economy. During the 50s and 60s, when manufacturing was ascendant, as I said, 55% 35 to 40% of Milwaukee's labor force was unionized. Today, only 5% of private sector workers in Milwaukee are covered. Even in sectors that were formerly unionized strongholds, such as manufacturing, the unionization rate has fallen precipitously. Milwaukee has experienced deindustrialization and deunionization, and the result has been a collapse of household incomes by more than 12% adjusted for inflation between 79 and 2010. And during the decade of 81 to 91, the number of high poverty census tracts in the city of Milwaukee, and these are principally in central city neighborhoods on the north and south side, has more than tripled, more than any other city in the country. The impact on Milwaukee's Black community and on its blue collar middle class has been nothing short of a silent depression. So, is there any cause for hope? Can we rebuild an industrial middle class, or can we rebuild a blue collar middle class? And I think there are some signs of hope if we look at some recent developments around the country. One is that's taking place in Alabama right now at Amazon. Amazon is today the world's largest employer. I can't remember, I just listened to a podcast, and Amazon either added 500,000 or 1 million jobs worldwide during the pandemic. And I'm sure most of you who are listening to this have used Amazon at one time or another during the pandemic. In Alabama, in one of the large warehouses that is largely an African-American labor force, they are now having a union drive. They're actually voting as we speak. The vote ends at the end of the month. And it's very likely that this will become the first Amazon facility in the United States that's unionized. What's important about this is not only that it would be similar to the victory at Flint in 1937 by the UAW, where the largest, most aggressive employer in the country was brought to heel, but it's being led by what I call the new working class. That is, the working class of the stereotypical working class of the white guy with a hard hat is not the working class of America today. It actually never was the working class of America. But today, the working class, as we see in Alabama, is largely people of color, immigrants, significantly large numbers of women. These are the people that are going to have to rebuild the labor movement and rebuild the working middle class. Those are the stakes in Alabama. And there's a term that some people use that we're seeing in Alabama is what we call civil rights unionism. Unlike when the AFL, or the CIO rather, in the early 50s launched something called Operation Dixie, which was an attempt to organize the non-union South, the right to work South. Taft-Hartley had allowed those states to be, those former slave states and Confederate states, to become non-union. So the CIO, before it had merged with the AFL, launched something called Operation Dixie. But it was adamant that it should not address the race issue, the issue of racial discrimination and segregation, which was prevalent throughout the South. And as a result, the effort was a failure, an entire failure. What we're seeing today in Alabama is the opposite approach. Rather than ignore the race issue, the Black workers who are leading this fight are in many ways products of the Black Lives Matters movement. They're products, and they are taking that energy and that passion and that militancy into the warehouse and using it to organize the union. That's where there's hope. That's where there's possibility. And we even have that here in Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, we've had the situation at the Bucks Arena, the Fiserv Center, where MASH, the Milwaukee Area Service and Hospitality Workers Organization, was able to use its political clout to organize all 1,500, not just the construction workers, the skilled construction workers who are often unionized on major publicly funded projects, but they unionize that place wall to wall. The bartenders, the servers, all the people who worked in the restaurants and in the Bradley Center, the Fiserv Center, all became members of MASH. Now, of course, with COVID, their membership has suffered tremendous setbacks, but those are the kinds of efforts that have the potential of possibility to rebuilding the working middle class in this country and in this community. And I think that while we've seen a lot of devastation and a lot of poverty, and with it, a lot of despair among people who have lost, in many ways, lots of hope, I think that these shoots of hope, whether at Amazon or at Fiserv, represent a way back, a way to fight inequality in this country, a way to fight racial discrimination in employment, and a way to revive the middle class in the service and hospitality sectors, which are the fastest growing sectors of the economy and where the largest number of unorganized workers are today. I think I'll leave it at that. I don't know. I think I made the time limit.
You did, Mike. Thank you. So we now welcome Sheila to tender her observations regarding this topic.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Michael. And I want to say that it's not only what Michael said, but a lot of my personal life. When I think about the things that Michael just talked about, I can just give you illustration after illustration. So I'll start with some that are extraordinarily personal to me. Around 1954, my Uncle Leonard, who was a brilliant man, he came to Milwaukee from Tennessee with a degree in mathematics, and he wanted to become a teacher in the public school system. He wasn't able to because of discrimination. He became a machinist at American Can Company. And that was our first realization and first, I think, increase in family income when it comes to our family overall. We all lived in a very small house on 6th and Meineke, and there were 3 families in that little house. And because of depression or whatever else we were going through at the time, but I was somewhat unaware of, he was able to leave with his family. And when he was able to leave, it was because he had gotten this job at American Can, and he purchased a home on 16th and Ring. And at the time, 16th and Ring did not look anywhere near what it looks like right now. It was a drop-dead beautiful neighborhood. He had a great home. We all went there for all kinds of occasions. And it was one of the first times that we could see upward mobility within our family. After that, little by little, all of our relatives were employed, most of the men, in some form of manufacturing. I had an uncle who was at A.O. Smith. I had an uncle who, once he came out of the Vietnam War, went to Harley Davidson. My brother walked out of Rufus King High School and went to Harley Davidson. And any number of our friends and relatives worked between most of the places that Michael mentioned and the breweries, which he did not. But I think that we forget in Milwaukee that food is manufactured. And so for us, places like Ambrosia Chocolate, the Schlitz Brewery, the Miller Brewery, all of these places that were prevalent in what we now look at as downtown Milwaukee were not only, I think, the stalwarts of our community, but they were very familiar and they helped expand. In every one of those situations, every family not only prospered, but was given a leg up. I would say across the board, yes, there was discrimination, but what there wasn't and what there was a level playing field when it came to wages. It wasn't necessarily the best playing field for the work. I will say that my uncle Moses, who came out of Vietnam, his last assignment was white glove service, driving generals around for the Pentagon. But when he got to Harley Davidson, he pushed a broom. It didn't matter to him. He retired with 2 pensions. His wife didn't have to work. She took care of all of our kids. And thus we had someone who was able to be a housewife, which was an oddity in our family because that did not exist. I will say that when I got married to my husband in, I think it was 1975, one of the first things he did was when he came to Milwaukee was look for a job. And he ended up with his business degree at the Social Development Commission. And at that time, he was one of these folks that did, I guess, what we would define now as outreach, not necessarily community organizing, but that's what he did. One of the first things that his biggest assignment was to get African-American people to go to Delco Electronics in Oak Creek in about 1976 or so. And he literally went, and I'm talking micro here, the office at the time was on Burleigh, and I can't remember the cross street, but the area of where Fond du Lac and Burleigh cross, somewhere along in that area. And he walked around that neighborhood literally telling Black people, no matter who they were, if they could just make it to Oak Creek, they could possibly get a job, and a good paying job. After all of that, I had been working for a daycare center for, I think, about 7 years. And one day we had a discussion about my wages. I had risen to the high wage of $3.79 by July of 1979. I think my starting wage was about $1.10, somewhere along in there, but I had to negotiate those increases myself over the course of those 7 years with a minister who wasn't really about upward mobility, more or less anything, but that was my ending wage. In July of 1979, I got a job at Delco Electronics too. And by that time, my husband had also worked there. They had a list inside of Delco that no one would possibly know about. And it was one that we used to refer to inside of the plant once we got there as the friends, brothers, and in-laws list, because Delco had an internal hiring as well as external hiring. But the only reason that they were externally hiring was because they had military contracts. And much like Michael said, because of non-discrimination, they could not discriminate, but they did hire very carefully. So I was hired in a class of 18 people. It entailed 2 African-American women, 2 white women, 1 or 2 cognitively maybe disabled people, and the balance were all white men. But we got hired. And in 1979, my $3.79 wage went from $3.79 the week before to $8.56 an hour the week thereafter, with a full benefit package. And I do mean a full benefit package that entailed all types of things that I would never have even imagined. The level playing field was our contract, just like Michael said. There was discrimination within the plant, yeah, some, but I will say that Michael referenced me being at MATC. One of the first questions that Dr. Burkholz asked me, who was the president of the college, when I came to MATC, was I discriminated more because of race or sex? And I told him that I'd probably at that point been discriminated more because of race. The work that I did at Delco Electronics was balanced between men and women, and I could do anything a man could do in that plant. And the only issue I had to do, or the only thing I would have to do, is just apply for an upgraded job, which I did. And so when I left Delco Electronics in 1999 and was elected to the position of the Secretary Treasurer of the Milwaukee Labor Council, I don't know when I hit $15 an hour, but I can tell you that by the time I left in 1999, I was well over $25 an hour. And that was straight time and not necessarily double time, triple time, time and a half, overtime with shift premiums or anything else. Our contract was one of the most desired contracts, I would say, in the country, because not only did we build electronics, it was a type of thing that we did. We did military specs. We did the black boxes for commercial airlines. We did black boxes that had the ability, as I was told, to pinpoint a traffic light anywhere around the world. Those were kept very quiet, but that was the reason we were hired. The work that I did was the computers that you will find in all of your General Motors cars, including mine. Very proud of those. I know they're a headache, but they're running the world, and pretty soon you will be able to drive an electric car. I know that because before I left, General Motors demonstrated a fully automated van with every bell and whistle you could in it, and it drove itself. The technology has been around forever. The skills that I learned there, I could take anywhere else in the city of Milwaukee had I wanted to at the time, and go to any other manufacturing facility. The difficulty is, as Michael had said, there weren't a lot of them around. We had a very diverse workforce because of those policies. And quite frankly, our jobs were associated with one of the good things that President Nixon did at the time, and that was sign the Clean Air Act. And so for those people that worry about what happens if you have a green economy, that's what happens. You get great jobs because there are an awful lot of them. I currently live in the Sherman Park area. And this is an area of the city of Milwaukee that when I was a kid, my mother used to drive through and look at all the beautiful homes. It's not the only place I've lived in Milwaukee, but it's the last place I'm going to live in Milwaukee. And one of the hopeful signs in this area, I sincerely hope, is that the now barren area where A.O. Smith was and where Century City is might get an Oshkosh truck facility for building, or Oshkosh defense contracts for building electric trucks for the Postal Service. For those of you who don't know, those would be UAW jobs. Oshkosh Truck is a defense contractor that builds in Oshkosh, obviously, but those military contracts are not only lucrative, they are championed by our congressional delegation. Thank you, Gwen Moore and Tammy Baldwin. And we try our level best to make sure that when those contracted jobs come into an area, the hiring is local. And we could most certainly use that boom. In reference to the Reagan era, this was when, I will say internally in my plant at Delco, I became the most politically active. And it served me well from that day until now. There's nothing that has happened to Milwaukee that hasn't been politically motivated, that hasn't had a very almost systematic reason for happening. If you know anything about our history, and maybe some of you don't, Michael mentioned Alice Chalmers. The destruction of organized labor started there. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I have a book about it upstairs. And it's how they would hold these captive audience meetings and begin to tell unionized workers how bad unions were, and try and work them down from the sensibilities that they had as being part of the proletariat, until, you know, the very individualistic notion that they could do it all on their own, and how bad the unions supposedly were. And I can tell you from my very public job at the Milwaukee Labor Council that there was not a day, an hour, or time that I spent there and still engage in all those issues that have to do with voting rights, civil rights, economic rights, the rights for this city to do better than it does. Because as Michael described, I could visibly see how the decline of our Black labor force was happening. I didn't get there by happenstance. I was a delegate to the Labor Council. I was asked by then Secretary Treasurer John Goldstein to run as the Secretary Treasurer. In 2005, when John left, the AFL had a split in its leadership nationally, and I became the sole officer of the Labor Council. One of the reasons for my visibility and public face was that, quite frankly, and this was something that someone did say to me one time, and I had to own it. I was the highest ranking African-American elected official of the AFL-CIO in the state of Wisconsin. And as such, it carried quite a load. And so I was not going to be quiet. I was not going to be silent. I still, you know, carry some of that even into retirement. But the point, in fact, is to fix the issues that we have in Milwaukee, you have to be intentional. Organizing unions isn't easy. People have to want to. I sincerely hope that it happens at Amazon. I will say this, when it comes to politics, and of course, labor unions look at this all the time, our members, unfortunately, will vote against their own self-interest. They've been doing it for years. They listen to the kind of foolishness that we've gone through for the past 4 years. They think that some poor immigrant is coming around to take their job, not knowing that the jobs that those people have that are so atrocious and so disgusting on the bottom end of the rung are jobs that they can't even imagine. And one that is still glued in my mind to this day is when we were assisting the organizing effort by the food and commercial workers. One was with the packing house, and another one was, and I can't remember the, Unite here, is when it was with laundry workers on the south side of Milwaukee. And I just want to start with that one because that one disturbs me the most. These were people who did not speak English. These were men and women, sometimes family members. And in this instance, one was a family member. Both of them were separated by one floor or two. I can't remember because we weren't allowed inside. But the woman was pregnant and she was literally ready to deliver. She was at her station in this laundry, hot, heat. The laundry that they worked on was the filth from hospitals and the germ-infested crap that comes from them. I forget the employer's name, thankfully, but her husband was upstairs and she was downstairs. When her water broke, her supervisor told her that she would have to wait until after work in order to go to the hospital to have her child. Sexism, racism, overt, just pure disregard for humanity is something that our employers don't really care about as long as they have a bottom line. I don't care who the individual is. I don't care where they're from. I think that it is imperative that if you work for and in the private sector and the public sector, your best bet for upward mobility in your economy and in your work life is going to be in a unionized atmosphere, no matter how good or bad you think that union might be. When it came to the meat packers, we had an opportunity to really organize the largest part of that plant. But because we had one unit of people who wanted to go first and their organizing effort wasn't very good, the employee was able to pit the workforce against each other. And I remember this because it was heartbreaking as well. And this was a different type of issue. This was internal discrimination within the plant. The largest part of the plant and the most lucrative part of the plant that made the most money was called the chuck room. And this is where a predominantly African-American group of men finished chuck roasts and chuck steaks. Outside of that room and within the rest of the packing facility were men and women of Latino descent. And a lot of these workers that were there, they were not all probably citizens at the time, but that was the employer who hired them. I say all this to say that in this town, we have unfortunately had an instance where Black and brown have been pitted against each other, where Black and white have been pitted against each other, and where union and non-union workers have been pitted against each other. And the only way that we will have any more upward mobility in this town, especially within the middle class of this town, is for people to recognize that those issues are superficial when it comes to the real issue of having a great life. I can retire today, and I am retired today because the UAW supports me by a pension that I paid into and they support it. I have good health care because of it. I've been able to stay home and avoid getting sick with COVID because of that. I own my home. I own my UAW made Cadillac car that I paid for out of my union wages. Well done, thank you. And I will not ever stop supporting my union. My union dues as a retiree are $2 a month. I increased them to 20 because that's what they've done for me. And I know my time is up, and I thank you for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much for two really instructive, powerful presentations. I'm sure everyone who is attending and who will see this in the future will agree with the high quality of these two presentations. Thank you, Mike and Sheila. We're going to open this up to questions now. Before we do, I just want to make one comment regarding the starting wage that Sheila referenced when she went to Delco. You know, if you adjust that $8.69 wage for inflation, it's $32 per hour. You know, so not bad for 1979 and not bad for 2021.
True.
In fact, General Motors workers now have starting wages which are a good bit lower than that, and in fact, almost 50% lower than that, which is a bit of a travesty, and it's really hurt the working class in our country. Let me reference two questions. I don't know if you can see them on the Q&A text panel, but if you can't, let me just read them. One of them is from one of our PhD students who really does tremendous work within our department. She's from Brazil, Dalila Negreiros, and she asks this. She says, this phenomenon of deindustrialization and the effects on the Black population seems to be similar in cities like Milwaukee and Detroit. However, I have this impression that the lack of prospects in Milwaukee is greater due to mass incarceration. What is specific to Milwaukee versus what is similar to other cities? Now, I would just add before you answer that if I don't have the data on the per capita incarceration rates in Milwaukee and Detroit, but I do have them for the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, and they are almost exactly identical at 676 per 100,000 in Wisconsin versus 641 per 100,000 residents in the state of Michigan. But do either of you have any comment on that?
Sheila, do you want to?
Yeah, I will just say that I think one of the phenomena is the difference in the political clout of Black people in Detroit versus the political clout that they have in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is not as Black as Detroit is, quite frankly. And even with Detroit's poverty, the Black population there still has political clout. You could see it in this past election. We have less of that here. And because of that, they also have more Black elected officials, and they have a sense of a Black middle class that might be outside of the city. And one of the differences between Detroit and Milwaukee is Detroit is a city by itself, struggling by itself. So its county, the counties around it don't help support the city of Milwaukee, where in the counties in Milwaukee help it, the surrounding areas. So an awful lot of the affluence in Detroit has moved out of the city and, you know, lives out like 7 Mile Road and the burbs and what have you. But it still has its clout and it still has its reputation. And General Motors moved its headquarters downtown where the Renaissance Center is, or I forgot what they call it now, but the last time I was there, I think they call it General Motors Towers now, whatever it is, but they moved in that area. So you still have the bulk of the industry still in Detroit. So there are, I think, more opportunities, possibly. They definitely have enough industry still there where the UAW is still fighting along with some of the other unions associated with it. We don't have a particular industrial union located in the city of Milwaukee with any strength to really push back against our political establishment like they do in Detroit.
Great. Mike, I want to just keep the questions and the answers real short if we can, so that we can move through a few of them. Do you have any observations, or shall we move on?
Well, it's not something I've studied, and it's not something that I know the data on. I think Sheila's perception or remarks are accurate, that in Detroit, and not only in Detroit, but in Michigan as a whole, the Black community has had more political power. In large part, that's due to a result of the UAW. The first Black mayor of Detroit was a former UAW lawyer. Coleman Young was affiliated with the UAW as well. And the Black population in Michigan is significantly larger than it is in Milwaukee. So I do think, or in Wisconsin, that is. Milwaukee's Black, the other thing is that Detroit's Black population grew in large numbers much earlier than Milwaukee's. So it developed much stronger roots, both in the city's industries before deindustrialization ravaged the city. And that allowed for the development of a large non-industrial Black middle class as well, a professional class. The children of those industrial workers who didn't go into the plant and follow their parents went on to become teachers and social workers, politicians, engineers, based on the UAW level wages and benefits that their parents were earning. And so you had now much of that Black middle class moved out. So unlike Milwaukee, where we are surrounded by suburbs like Washington County, Ozaukee County, and Waukesha County that are largely white and very among the most right-wing reactionary suburbs in the country. In Detroit, you have suburbs that are much more integrated with larger Black populations, and that also politically has some impact. At the same time, I do not know if it's the case that I know mass incarceration is a horrendous problem for Black people in Wisconsin. I don't know what the data is or the reality is in Michigan and Detroit.
Yeah, my guess is that the per capita incarceration rates for African Americans is greater in Wisconsin than in Michigan, even though they're at parity in terms of the state population generally.
Yeah.
Michigan's African American community constitutes twice the percentage of the population of their state at
Right.
14%
Right.
versus Wisconsin, which is at around a little under 7%. So yeah, I suspect that's what the data would reveal. An additional
But the point I was making was that the suburbs around Detroit are not nearly as reactionary, and therefore, when the war on drugs and the war on African Americans, frankly, was intensified or launched in Milwaukee, there was more of a buffer against such a political buffer in a place like Michigan, where you had a larger Black middle class and a much long-standing middle class. Remember, Reverend Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, led a massive march in Detroit in 1963 before the March on Washington. It was a march that Dr. Martin Luther King spoke at. There's a great book called Detroit, Once a Great City that I'd urge anybody to read to know more about the history of Detroit.
Right, great. One of my colleagues, Professor Gladys Mitchell-Walthor, who is always doing two things at once and getting 3 times as much done as anyone else, consequently, has this question. She had to depart early. She says, can the panelists expand on the term blue-collar middle class? In general, the Black American middle class makes much less than the white middle class. What makes Milwaukee's blue-collar middle class during the earlier time period different than the Black middle class in general? So I'm assuming that your response is going to be unions and union contracts ensuring equal payment. Is there anything else in addition to that?
Well, the point I was just making about the evolution of Detroit and how Detroit peaked in the late 50s and early 60s in terms of population growth.
Yeah.
And the black population or Black migration to Detroit took place in the 40s, 50s, whereas in Milwaukee, the very large Black migration was a late 1950s, 1960s. So in Detroit, Black people were moving in when the industrial economy was robust. As I said, it gave them, many people, a generation or two to get an economic foothold and create some upward mobility for their children, creating more of a what I'd call a professional middle class. Doesn't mean there weren't large numbers of African Americans working in the industrial jobs as well, but it created this much larger professional or non-industrial Black middle class. In Milwaukee, that growth was much later, and it took place right as deindustrialization began to hit the city.
Right. I mean, definitely because of that late migration, we see a delayed capital and wealth formation. It's a shorter period and it happens later. So that's going to have devastating effects, of course, for the African American community in Milwaukee versus some other cities with that more long-standing African American presence. Absolutely. Any other questions from our audience? Rachel, I don't know if you can, that's our fantastic program associate in our department. Can you help us to see if there are any further questions that people would either like to tender live or if they would like to do so by text?
We do have one question from Bunny Booker. Her question is, what are the plans to organize the unpaid worker in assisted living facilities? This is a growing work population consisting primarily of people of color, single women.
Yeah, I will say that one of the first organizing efforts we started with the Labor Council was assisting the Service Employees Union in actually organizing those people. Some of them are, or at least they're organized within, I think, the Service Employees Union. I can't tell you if they ever got a contract because of some of the machinations with the individual, in some instances, the healthcare facilities, and in other instances, legislation. And I do believe, unless I am mistaken, that one of the first acts under the Walker administration was to take away the contract. They had literally, I think they had
Home
just,
healthcare workers.
yes, the home healthcare workers had just won. I think they solidified that win in 2010, and Walker came in 2011, and they were wiped off the map. So they lost the gain that they had. And I think one of the biggest things that happened under Act 10 that no one ever talks about, that I was acutely aware of, is how many Black people lost their union membership under the Walker administration. In the city of Milwaukee, we lost AFSCME, and AFSCME workers under unionization. Most of them, and an awful lot of them that worked in the county, the city of Milwaukee, the ones that worked within the school systems, all of these people, because they were public sector workers, were wiped out of their unionization via legislation. And again, this was political. The thing that I'm not going to leave this without saying is, there's a reason why, besides the wages, workers organize. They organize for protection. And don't ever forget that. Every time we've had an organizing drive, it's always been about protection. People will work, as you have seen, for meager wages. But you can do something really foolish to someone that hurts them personally, and then they begin to understand that they need that protection over and above. So most of these pieces, including this thing down at Amazon, a lot of this has to do with health and safety, the actual workforce itself, and how it's being treated and misused and mishandled, the critical conditions they find themselves in. I mean, we're in a pandemic, and we're asking these people to come to our homes, drop off packages. We're not always being good to them when they do it. And so, you know, it's the kind of thing that is not seen, but it most certainly occurs all of the time. And over and above that, we lost a professional union under legislation in that same time frame. The largest Black professional group in the city of Milwaukee were our principals, supervisors, and administrators of the Milwaukee public school system. They lost their unionized rights via legislation before Act 10. And so those are the people that no one was going to clamor for and go running around for. And then, of course, it was the teachers and the professors and the instructors at MATC under Michael's leadership and other union officials. These were a professional class of people. And if you have any Black professionals in those areas that were making good wages, they had to really come back and really fight hard to continue to keep their unions up. And once you knock the underpinning out of a union's leadership and infrastructure by taking an immediate sweep across the entire state of Wisconsin, that's a lot to come back from. And the people that were hurt the most were the ones who, even after the deindustrialization, had, much like my daughter, become people who were now trying to move into a profession and couldn't move into a profession because their professions were knocked from under them. So I think that this is something that really does, and I hope that people begin to look at it closer, because your most likely unionized member and the easiest person to organize is always going to be a Black woman. We are not stupid. We will cling to
exactly what Scott Walker was going after. I mean, the last significant pool of the blue collar middle class were public employees. and those were largely or disproportionately women of color. So it was a direct attack on that population, no doubt. We have to close up because we're running out of time, but we have time for one more question. If you can provide a quick answer. This comes from Susan Osatek, I believe at St. John's on the Lake, and she asks, how soon will food service employees, i.e. McDonald's, be unionized? So, Mike, Sheila, if you have 1 or 2 minutes.
I taught economics for 29 years, and I've always said that economics is not about crystal ball forecasting. So I can't answer that question directly, but what I will say is this. There has been a movement for at least maybe 5, maybe even a little longer than that, years, the Fight for 15. And it has had a dramatic impact. It hasn't established collective bargaining units in the traditional sense, where you bargain for wages and benefits with the employer at McDonald's or Burger King or one of the chicken places, Kentucky Fried Chicken. But what it has done is it has elevated the issue of raising the minimum wage to the point that Amazon is now running ads in the New York Times bragging about paying $15 an hour and urging that a $15 minimum wage be passed. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that that doesn't have something to do with the union drive going on in Alabama. But the fact of the matter is that what we've seen with the Fight for 15, which has basically been organized by the Service Employees Industrial Union, is that innovative tactics above and beyond traditional organizing of a collective bargaining unit has some impact. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be better to also have successfully organized people across McDonald's, but that's very difficult to do because you have people are in and out of those jobs, and you have small workforces. And because people's rights on their jobs currently are so unprotected that anybody who starts organizing gets fired, and it takes a long time, even if they're unjustly fired, to get hired back. Principally now, our labor force in this country is not just cause, it's at will. Means you can be fired at the discretion of the employer. So I think what's exciting, or what is hopeful, is that there are innovative responses developing. There was a Justice for Janitors movement that tried to organize janitors across a community like in Houston and other towns, rather than just in one facility. There's the Fight for 15. There was the MASH example. And then in larger facilities like the warehouse in Alabama, where you have large numbers of workers working together, there seems to be some potential.
Right.
In terms of the assisted living places, you have the same problem. At-will employees, who are really scattered. There's not large concentrations concentrating together, and it makes it very difficult. And of course, right now, politically, the power of up until the recent election, the power of employers has been so overwhelming to make it very difficult to organize. President Biden just made the most pro-union statement that I've ever heard a president make in my lifetime.
Mike, we got to end there.
Okay. So there is some.
I just have to say, I hope we here in Milwaukee and in other places can continue and will work to draw upon both Sheila and your Mike impressive analysis and reservoir of experience and wisdom. This has been very beneficial for me personally, and I'm sure it has been for the panelists, not for the panelists, but the participants here, and for those who are going to be viewing this event on our Facebook page and on YouTube, which we will also place this talk. The Department of African and African Diaspora Studies has a full seminar schedule. You can go to our department webpage at UWM to view that. You can also go to our Facebook page. We hope to see more people join us for impressive talks such as these. So with that, I thank you both. Let's continue to remain in dialogue, and let's hope for success in Alabama.
Yes.
Thanks to the
Thank you.
department and to you, Jeff and Sheila.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.